Ava Brooks gripped the edge of the prosecution table, her pulse steady, despite the blatant corruption unfolding before her. Across the room, Judge Richard Calloway barely looked up as he dismissed the latest piece of evidence. The sound of his gavel hitting the desk echoed through the tense courtroom, a cold reminder that this wasn't about justice. It was about control. On the other side, Officers Mark Evans and Jake Turner sat back in their chairs, their arrogance on full display. They had been through trials like this before, always walking free. They knew the judge had their backs. This was just another day of the system working in their favor. Ava exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. They thought she was just another powerless prosecutor. They had no idea who she really was, but they were about to find out in the most humiliating way possible. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more shocking real-life justice stories. Ava Brooks let her fingers loosen against the smooth wood of the prosecution table, her face remaining calm despite the burning injustice unfolding before her. Across the courtroom, Officers Mark Evans and Jake Turner leaned back in their chairs, their smirks barely hidden, as Judge Richard Calloway ruled in their favor once again. They knew the game. This wasn't about truth or evidence. It was about power. For Ava, this case was personal, not because of who the defendants were, but because of what they represented, a system that had failed too many times. A system where officers like Evans and Turner could brutalize innocent people and still walk free, shielded by men like Judge Calloway. But today would be different. Ava had spent years exposing corrupt officials, standing in rooms just like this one where justice was treated as an inconvenience. She had learned to control her emotions, to let her silence become her greatest weapon. That was why she didn't flinch when the judge waved his hand dismissively, barely making eye contact with her as he denied another key piece of evidence. It was clear what he was doing. He wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in protecting the men sitting across from her. Judge Richard Calloway had been on the bench for over 15 years, and in that time, his bias had never been questioned. No case involving police misconduct had ever ended in conviction under his watch. He was confident that this case would be no different. His court, his rules. He had built his reputation on shielding law enforcement, ensuring they remained above scrutiny no matter what they did. His rulings weren't based on the law. They were based on who he wanted to protect. On the other side of the courtroom, Robert Hale, the defense attorney, watched Ava with a smirk. He had been in these situations before, facing prosecutors who thought they could beat a rigged system. None had succeeded. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Miss Brooks, you seem awfully tense. Perhaps you'd like to withdraw your case before embarrassing yourself further." His voice was laced with mockery, the words designed to cut. Ava simply blinked at him, her expression unreadable. If only he knew. The courtroom was full today. Reporters, community leaders, and citizens who had seen cases like this one disappear before they even had a chance. Many had come expecting the same old story. A prosecutor fighting a losing battle, a judge turning a blind eye, and 2 officers walking away without consequences. But something about Ava Brooks was different. She had let the judge play his game long enough. She had let him interrupt her, let him dismiss the evidence, let him enjoy the illusion of control. But now it was time. Ava straightened her posture, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Then she calmly shut her legal pad and placed both hands on the table. The small movement shouldn't have meant anything, but something about it shifted the energy in the room. Then, for the first time since the trial had begun, she smiled. Judge Calloway raised an eyebrow, suddenly unsure. The officers, still confident, didn't notice. Then Ava spoke, her voice smooth and steady. "Your Honor, before you make another mistake, there's something you should know about me." The courtroom went silent. Something was about to happen, and for the first time, Judge Calloway didn't feel like he was in control. Ava Brooks' words settled over the courtroom like a storm cloud, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Richard Calloway, who had exuded nothing but arrogance and authority all morning, visibly stiffened. The certainty in his posture wavered, but only slightly. Still, Ava had seen it. She had been in enough courtrooms, faced enough corrupt officials to know when a man realized he had made a mistake. Robert Hale, the defense attorney, let out a forced chuckle, the kind meant to ease tension but failing miserably. "Something we should know, Ms. Brooks?" he asked. Amusement laced through his words, though there was an edge to his voice now. He had felt the shift, too. The atmosphere had changed. Officers Mark Evans and Jake Turner, still lounging in their seats with smug expressions, remained blissfully unaware. Turner leaned over to whisper something to Evans, who smirked in response. They weren't worried. They had done this before. They had heard the outrage, the fiery speeches from prosecutors, the grandstanding about justice. None of it had ever mattered. They always walked away. Ava slowly tapped her fingers against the table, maintaining her measured composure. "I find it curious, Your Honor," she began, her voice smooth, "that every attempt to present evidence has been denied without so much as a proper review, almost as if—" She paused for effect, her gaze locking onto Calloway's. This ruling was decided before we even stepped into this courtroom. A murmur spread through the spectators. Even the jury exchanged uneasy glances. Judge Calloway's fingers curled tightly around his gavel before he slammed it down. "Careful, Miss Brooks. Watch your tone." His voice, once dismissive, now carried a subtle tremor. Ava tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Oh, I intend to, because I know exactly what's happening here, and I think it's time the court does too." Hal scoffed, leaning back in his chair trying to regain control. "Oh, here we go. The usual conspiracy theories. Let me guess, Ms. Brooks. You believe my clients are victims of a corrupt system?" He turned to the jury, shaking his head with exaggerated amusement. "Honestly, I've heard this speech so many times I could recite it myself." Ava didn't react. Instead, she calmly reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small black leather folder. She placed it on the table in front of her with deliberate slowness. The movement wasn't dramatic, wasn't meant to shock, but it did. Judge Calloway's eyes flickered toward the folder, his jaw tightening. But before he could speak, Ava flipped it open, revealing a gold federal badge. The emblem of the United States Department of Justice gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights. A hush fell over the room. The reaction was immediate. Judge Calloway's expression froze. Hale's smirk vanished in an instant. The officers, who had been lounging just seconds ago, sat up straight. The arrogance drained from their faces as reality set in. They had been playing the wrong game with the wrong person. Ava leaned forward slightly, her voice steady, but now carrying an undeniable weight. "Your Honor, I am not just a prosecutor. I am a U.S. attorney appointed by the Department of Justice. And as of now, I am opening a formal federal investigation into this case, as well as your judicial conduct. The judge's face turned pale. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every moment. The shift in power had never been more evident. Judge Calloway was no longer in control. Ava wasn't finished. She turned her attention to the two officers, her eyes locking onto theirs with a precision that made them visibly uneasy. Officers Evans and Turner, you may have thought today would end with another slap on the wrist. But let me be clear. You are no longer just standing trial for misconduct. You are now under federal review for civil rights violations, excessive force, and obstruction of justice. Turner swallowed hard. Evans' jaw clenched, but neither spoke. Their confidence had shattered in mere seconds. Judge Calloway, desperate to regain control, finally found his voice. "Miss Brooks, this is highly irregular. I suggest—" Ava didn't let him finish. "No, Your Honor. What's highly irregular is a sitting judge dismissing crucial evidence in a case where the facts are undeniable. What's highly irregular is a courtroom where justice is determined not by law, but by personal biases." Calloway's fingers twitched around his gavel. For years, he had ruled without consequence, ensuring officers like Evans and Turner always walked free. He had never expected someone like Ava Brooks. She let the silence stretch. Then, in a voice so calm yet so lethal, she asked, "Would you like to reconsider your ruling, Your Honor? Or shall I have this case moved to federal court?" The entire courtroom held its breath. For the first time in his career, Judge Richard Calloway was no longer the most powerful person in the room. A heavy silence swallowed the courtroom. Judge Richard Calloway, who had spent years commanding absolute authority in this very room, sat frozen in his chair. The weight of Ava Brooks' words bore down on him like a boulder, a federal investigation. He had ruled over countless cases, dismissed evidence without question, and protected officers like Evans and Turner without consequence. But now, for the first time, he was the one on trial. The audience remained in stunned silence, eyes darting between the judge and Ava. The two officers, Mark Evans and Jake Turner, who had been so smug only minutes ago, no longer looked so sure of themselves. Turner wiped his palms against his pants, while Evans' leg bounced under the table. They had walked into this courtroom expecting another easy escape, confident in Calloway's protection. But now, their fate no longer rested in his hands. Ava let the silence stretch, watching as the reality of the situation sank in for everyone. Then, she calmly reached for her folder, flipping open a new document. "I'd like to formally submit a motion to admit the previously dismissed video footage into evidence," she said, her voice measured but firm. "Given the federal jurisdiction involved, any previous ruling barring it is now null and void." Judge Calloway's hand tightened around his gavel. His usual composure cracked just slightly. "Ms. Brooks, He hesitated, realizing that any decision he made now would be scrutinized beyond this courtroom. He was no longer operating under his usual unchecked power. He was being watched. Robert Hale, the defense attorney, cleared his throat, his confidence faltering. He had enjoyed watching the judge toy with the case, dismissing Ava's objections like swatting away a fly. But now, this was dangerous territory. If Calloway overturned his own ruling under pressure, it could open the door to further scrutiny. Hale leaned forward. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We should—" Ava didn't let him finish. She straightened, placing both hands on the table as she leveled her gaze at the judge. "Your Honor, I will ask one final time. Will you reconsider your ruling, or shall I take this to federal court?" The challenge in her voice sent a fresh wave of unease through the room. Calloway's fingers twitched against the wood of his bench. His entire career had been built on controlling the outcomes of trials like these, ensuring the system worked in favor of officers like Evans and Turner. But this was not a battle he could win, not this time. A muscle in his jaw twitched as he exhaled sharply. Motion granted. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Even Ava had to suppress a smile. She had expected resistance, had been prepared for a prolonged fight, but Calloway had folded faster than she anticipated. His fear of federal scrutiny had outweighed his loyalty to the officers. Mark Evans clenched his jaw, whispering harshly under his breath. Jake Turner wasn't even trying to hide his panic anymore, his fingers gripping the table as if steadying himself. The video footage would be seen. Ava nodded, unfazed. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like the evidence displayed now." A bailiff moved quickly, setting up the courtroom's projector as the tension in the room thickened. Within seconds, the video played. The grainy footage showed the two officers yanking a black man from his vehicle, throwing him to the ground. He wasn't resisting. His hands were already raised. Yet Evans and Turner struck him repeatedly, their voices laced with aggression as they barked orders he was already complying with. The video continued, showing them pinning him down, using excessive force that had no justification. The audience reacted immediately. Gasps, murmurs, whispers of outrage filled the room as people witnessed the truth that Calloway had tried to bury. Members of the jury exchanged looks, their faces shifting from uncertainty to realization. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a gray area. It was police brutality, clear as day. The officers sat rigid, eyes locked on the screen as their actions they had denied, laughed off, played out for the world to see. Robert Hale adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. He had spent the trial downplaying the severity of the accusations, banking on the assumption that there would be no undeniable proof. Now, with the entire courtroom seeing it with their own eyes, his defense had crumbled. Judge Calloway, still gripping his gavel, looked anywhere but at the screen. His face was a shade paler than before. He had worked so hard to suppress this evidence, and now it was the very thing unraveling his courtroom. Ava let the video finish, then turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case of misjudgment. This is not a case of necessary force. This is an abuse of power, and these officers have been protected for far too long." She shifted her gaze toward the judge. "Protected by a system that has failed to serve justice." For once, Calloway did not interrupt her. She turned back to the jury, letting her words sink in. "You now have the full truth. It is up to you to decide what happens next." The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel strike. The officers, once so confident, now looked like men who knew their time had run out. Judge Calloway sat stiffly, his authority no longer absolute. Robert Hale remained quiet, knowing there was nothing left to argue. Ava sat back down, knowing she had already won. The courtroom remained silent, thick with tension, as the final frame of the damning video faded from the screen. The once confident officers, Mark Evans and Jake Turner, sat motionless, their arrogance shattered. Their faces, once smug with the assurance of protection, had paled under the weight of undeniable evidence. The people in the courtroom, spectators, jury members, and even court officials, stared at them, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty that justice had finally caught up to them. Judge Richard Calloway cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His gavel, once an instrument of his unchecked power, now felt like a dead weight in his hand. He had spent years shielding men like Evans and Turner, dismissing cases just like this one. But today, he had been outplayed. He knew that if he backpedaled any further, he wouldn't just lose his reputation, he could lose his seat on the bench. Robert Hale, the defense attorney, ran a hand down his face, his earlier bravado completely erased. He had built his case on the assumption that this trial was just a formality, a minor inconvenience for men like his clients. But now, the jury wasn't just seeing the truth, they were feeling it. And that made all the difference. He swallowed hard before finally speaking. "Your Honor," he said, attempting to regain control, "in light of new circumstances, we request a short recess to reevaluate our position." Ava Brooks didn't even glance at him. Instead, she focused on the jury, watching as they exchanged knowing glances. They had already made up their minds. No amount of reevaluating would change what they had seen with their own eyes. Judge Calloway hesitated, his eyes darting toward Ava, searching for a way out. He had never faced this kind of opposition before. Never had he been so publicly cornered. Finally, he sighed and nodded stiffly. Recess granted. 15 minutes. The jury members stood and filed out, some shaking their heads as if still processing what they had just witnessed. The spectators, however, remained. They wanted to see what would happen next. They could sense it. This wasn't over. As the officers were escorted toward a private room, Ava stood still, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over her. She had spent years fighting cases like these, cases where justice was just out of reach. But today was different. Today, the system had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Brooks." She turned to see Robert Hale approaching, his usual arrogance now replaced by a quiet desperation. He adjusted his tie, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," he said smoothly. "There's no need to escalate this any further. We can reach a deal. A light sentence, maybe even probation. No need to ruin careers over a misunderstanding." Iva raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" she repeated, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Hale, your clients dragged a man out of his vehicle, threw him to the ground, and beat him while he begged for mercy. And they laughed while doing it." She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. "Tell me, how do you misunderstand that?" Hull hesitated, his jaw tightening. He had nothing left to argue. Ava smiled slightly, but it wasn't out of amusement, it was out of finality. The days of brushing these cases under the rug are over. Your clients are guilty, and we both know it. She leaned in just a little. "So, here's what's going to happen, Mr. Hale. You're going to walk back into that courtroom, and instead of wasting everyone's time, you're going to prepare your clients to face the consequences of their actions." Hale exhaled sharply, but he knew there was no way out of this. He nodded once before turning and walking away. Ava straightened her shoulders and took a slow breath. She could feel the shift in the air, the moment justice finally took center stage. As the court was called back into session, the jury members returned with a newfound determination in their eyes. Ava sat down, her expression unreadable, but deep inside, she already knew what their verdict would be. Justice wasn't just possible today, it was inevitable. As the courtroom doors swung open and the jury returned to their seats, the energy in the room was unmistakable. The weight of truth had settled on their shoulders, and Ava Brooks could see it in their faces. They had made their decision. She remained composed, her hands folded neatly on the prosecution table, but inside, she knew that the outcome was already sealed. Mark Evans and Jake Turner sat stiffly, their once confident smirks erased. The 15-minute recess had done little to save them. Their lawyer, Robert Hale, had abandoned all pretense of control, his face now set in tight resignation. He knew this trial had slipped beyond his grasp the moment Ava revealed who she truly was. The game was over. Judge Richard Calloway, his face grim and paler than before, cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably. Gone was the arrogance he had carried at the start of this trial. He had lost control of his own courtroom. The reality of the federal scrutiny looming over him had forced his hand, and for the first time, he looked like a man who realized he was just another pawn in a system he thought he controlled. The bailiff stood and addressed the courtroom. "Will the jury, foreperson, please stand?" A middle-aged woman with a composed expression rose from her seat. She held a small slip of paper in her hands, her voice unwavering as she read the verdict. "In the case of the State versus Officers Mark Evans and Jake Turner, we, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Some people clapped, others whispered to one another in stunned relief. The officers themselves froze, their bodies stiff as the reality of those words sank in. They weren't walking away this time. There was no corrupt judge who could erase the truth. Evans turned sharply to Hale, his face twisting in disbelief. "Do something," he hissed under his breath. "You said we had this in the bag." Hale exhaled, shaking his head. "Not anymore." Jake Turner slammed a fist onto the table, his voice cracking. "This is bullshit." He turned to Judge Calloway. "You can fix this. Enough." Calloway's voice came out hoarse, defeated. He no longer had the luxury of bending the law in their favor. Not with the world watching. Ava stood slowly, her voice clear as she spoke. "Your Honor, given the severity of the charges, the prosecution requests immediate revocation of bail and the immediate remand of both defendants into custody." Calloway hesitated, glancing at Evans and Turner, two men he had protected time and time again. But this time, there was no way out. He nodded. Motion granted. The gavel hit the desk one last time. The bailiffs approached the officers, cuffs in hand. For the first time, Evans and Turner found themselves on the other side of the law. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. They had walked into this courtroom expecting their usual escape. Now, they were being led away like criminals, because that's exactly what they were. Ava watched as they were escorted out. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk in victory. This was never about winning. This was about justice finally being served. As she gathered her documents, a voice stopped her. "Miss Brooks." She turned to see Judge Calloway watching her, his expression unreadable. For years, he had ruled over cases like this with unchecked power, knowing no one would challenge him. But today, he had been forced to face accountability for the first time. "You did well," he admitted, reluctantly, though his tone lacked warmth. It was the closest thing to respect she would ever get from him. Ava met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "This isn't about me, Your Honor. It's about making sure this never happens again." Calloway nodded slowly, but they both knew that change wouldn't come easily. He had lost today, but the real battle, the battle for a justice system that truly protected everyone, was far from over. As Ava stepped out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed her, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in her direction. "Ms. Brooks, how do you feel about the verdict? Did you expect the jury to convict?" What does this mean for future police trials? She paused, then answered with unwavering certainty. It means justice is still possible, and that's just the beginning. As she walked away, she could feel the weight of history shifting. Today, corruption had lost, and tomorrow, she would be ready for the next fight. As Ava Brooks stepped out of the courthouse, the cool breeze hit her face, carrying with it the murmurs of the crowd still buzzing with the weight of what had just unfolded inside. The flashing cameras and rapid-fire questions from reporters were relentless, but she had already said what needed to be said. Justice had been served, not because the system had worked as intended, but because it had been forced to. She paused for a moment, looking up at the sky, exhaling deeply. It wasn't over. This case was just one of many, and there would always be another courtroom, another corrupt official trying to twist the law in their favor, another battle to fight. But today had proven something important. The truth, when exposed, had the power to bring even the most untouchable men to their knees. Somewhere in the city, Judge Richard Calloway sat in his chambers, staring at the walls, knowing his reputation would never recover. Mark Evans and Jake Turner sat in holding cells, no longer protected by their badges. And the people who had watched this case unfold, they now had proof that change was possible. Ava tightened her grip on her briefcase and walked forward, not looking back. Tomorrow would bring another fight, but she was ready. What do you think? Did the officers get what they deserved? Should the judge face further consequences? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe in holding the powerful accountable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible real-life justice stories.